Little girl's hidden secret was exposed. Now Hell's Angels biker must protect her from the danger she unleashed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jake Razor Johnson had been a Hell's Angels member for nearly 2 decades. His reputation alone was enough to make anyone cross the street. But deep inside, beyond the tough exterior, he was just a man trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. A life of constant movement, constant risk. But the world had a funny way of pulling him back when he least expected it. It was a bitter, cold night when Jake's bike roared down a lonely stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. His Harley's engine was like thunder in the silence of the night, but even the rumble of his bike couldn't drown out the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The weather was turning worse by the minute, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the wind picking up. Jake's eyes were scanning the road ahead, but something caught his attention off to the side. A faint cry. It was a small sound, almost lost to the storm, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. Slowing down, Jake squinted through the darkness. It wasn't long before he saw her. A small figure, crouched beside the road, clutching something tightly to her chest. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled his bike to a halt. The girl, no older than 10, had dark, wet hair clinging to her face, her clothes soaked through from the rain. She looked like she had been out there for hours, alone and terrified. She wasn't just lost. She was in trouble. Without a second thought, Jake dismounted, his boots crunching the wet gravel underfoot. "Hey," he called out gently, his voice softer than usual. "Are you all right?" The girl flinched, her wide eyes darting up to meet his. For a moment, she didn't move, just stared at him, as if trying to figure out whether he was a friend or foe. Jake's large frame, his leather jacket, and the Hell's Angels patches on his back were enough to make anyone nervous. But the girl's eyes held something more than fear. There was a desperation in them, like she had seen too much too soon for someone so young. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said, crouching down to her level. The girl hesitated, but then, as if a switch had been flipped, she dropped the thing in her arms and rushed to him, her arms wrapping around his waist. Jake was momentarily taken aback by the sudden trust she placed in him. He slowly stood, gently lifting her into his arms. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now." But as he stood there in the pouring rain, holding the little girl, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary rescue. This girl wasn't just lost. She had a secret, one that had led her to this moment. The danger wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Jake carried the little girl, Lily, in his arms as he walked through the pouring rain. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The storm was growing stronger, and the cold wind made everything feel heavier, more urgent. The girl's small body trembled against his chest, but there was something else in her eyes now. A flicker of trust, perhaps, but also a deeper sadness, one that Jake couldn't quite place. He wasn't sure why he had stopped. He could have ridden past, kept going like he had so many times before, ignoring the world's problems, ignoring the cries for help. But something about her, the vulnerability, the sheer fear, made him act. As he reached his bike, Jake gently placed Lily on the back seat, securing her with his jacket. She didn't protest, but her eyes were still filled with something that Jake had seen before. It wasn't just fear. It was more like a burden, a secret too heavy for her to bear. He started the engine, the roar of the Harley cutting through the storm's noise, and set off toward the nearest shelter. As the road blurred in front of him, his thoughts drifted back to the old days. The Hell's Angels had been his family for so long, the only family that had ever really understood him. But it had come with a price. The price of losing everything else. His past wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a weight, an anchor that had kept him from ever being able to move forward. It was easy to get lost in the club, to stay on the road, to keep riding, to keep fighting. But when you're on the move all the time, there's nothing left to hold on to. No real connection, no one who could ever matter enough to make you stop. Until now. Until Lily. He glanced back at her, her small frame hunched against the cold, her face pale from the shock. There was a look in her eyes that made him uneasy. Something that felt like danger. Something that made him want to protect her even more than he already did. They reached an old diner on the outskirts of town, a place that Jake knew well. The lights were dim, the windows fogged with the heat inside. Jake parked the bike and turned to Lily. "Stay here," he said gently. "I'll go grab us something warm. You'll be safe." But Lily shook her head slightly, her small hands gripping the seat. I don't want to stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I don't want to be alone." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He couldn't leave her alone, not after what had happened. "All right, kid. You can come with me." As they walked into the diner, the warmth hit them immediately. The smell of coffee and frying food filled the air, a strange comfort in the midst of the storm. The few patrons in the diner barely glanced up as Jake and Lily made their way to a corner booth. Jake ordered a hot coffee for himself and a hot chocolate for Lily. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Lily sat with her arms crossed tightly, looking down at the table. Jake couldn't help but wonder what she was hiding. What was the secret she had exposed? What had brought her here, alone in the rain, in the middle of nowhere? As the waitress brought over their drinks, Jake decided to ask. "What happened, Lily?" he asked quietly, his voice softer than usual. Lily didn't answer right away. She just stared into her mug, her fingers tracing the rim as if searching for something to say. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to make it happen. I didn't know they would come after me." Jake frowned, his heart heavy with a sudden, gnawing fear. "Who's after you, kid?" Lily bit her lip, her hands trembling as she placed her mug back on the table. I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know who they are. But they said they'd hurt me if I told anyone. They said they'd hurt everyone." Jake's stomach twisted. He had no idea who she was talking about, but he knew one thing for sure. Whoever it was, they were dangerous. And if Lily was telling the truth, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. He reached across the table, his rough hand resting gently on hers. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'll keep you safe. No one's going to hurt you, not while I'm here." But deep inside, Jake knew this was just the beginning. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming for them. Jake sat across from Lily in the dimly lit diner, the hum of the refrigerator and clink of silverware filling the silence between them. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she had said. Whoever was after her wasn't just some local thug. No, this felt bigger, darker, and more dangerous. He had seen enough in his life to recognize when something wasn't right, and this situation screamed trouble. But who would come after a little girl like Lily? What kind of danger had she unknowingly unleashed? The coffee in front of him had long since gone cold, but Jake wasn't paying attention to that. He couldn't. His thoughts were consumed by Lily's words. She didn't know who the people were, but she was clearly terrified, and that fear made Jake's protective instincts flare up. No one was going to hurt this girl, not on his watch. He took a deep breath and focused on her. She had her head down, staring at the half-finished cup of hot chocolate in front of her. She hadn't said much since their arrival, just a few quiet words here and there. But he could see the weight of her emotions, the invisible burden she carried. "Lily, you don't have to be scared," Jake said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to help you. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out. But you need to tell me everything you know. It's the only way I can protect you." She hesitated, her eyes flicking up to meet his for a brief moment before she looked away again. She seemed lost in thought, battling her own demons. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I didn't know they would come after me. I didn't even know what I found. But when they realized what it was, they started coming after me. They said they'd hurt everyone. My grandma, my mom." Her voice faltered, and Jake could see the tears brimming in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, as if embarrassed by her emotions. Jake felt a surge of anger, not at Lily, but at whatever force was trying to hurt her. He couldn't let it happen. "It's okay, kid," he said, his voice softening. "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." He wasn't sure how he could stop whoever was after her, but he would do whatever it took. "Do you know what this thing is that they're after?" he asked. Lily nodded slowly. "It's a key," she said quietly. "A key to a place. A place where they hide things people shouldn't find. My mom, she kept it hidden. I didn't even know about it until I found it." But now they want it. And they'll do anything to get it. Jake's mind whirred as he tried to process this. A key? What kind of place was she talking about? And who were these people who would go to such lengths to get it? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. Whoever they were ruthless. I don't know where the key is anymore, Lily added, her voice shaking. I think I lost it when I ran. But they won't stop. They'll keep looking for me until they find it. Jake's heart clenched. This was bigger than he had imagined. These weren't just random people. These were dangerous individuals, and they had their sights set on Lily. We're going to figure this out, Jake said firmly, his jaw set with determination. We just need to lay low for a while, get some rest. I'm not letting anyone hurt you, Lily. Not now, not ever. She nodded, but her eyes were still clouded with fear. Jake could see the toll this was taking on her. She was just a little girl, caught in a storm far too big for her. He could only imagine what she had been through. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Jake now, and Jake was going to protect her. He could feel it in his bones. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain. Whoever these people were, they would regret ever coming after this little girl. As Jake stood up, he glanced at the door. The storm outside was still raging, but there was a calmness in his chest. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had a purpose now. He was going to find out who was after Lily, and he was going to stop them. He wasn't doing this alone anymore. With Lily by his side, they had a chance. They had a chance to beat whatever was coming for them. He turned back to Lily, offering her a reassuring smile. You're going to be okay, he said softly. We'll get through this together. The storm was far from over, but with each passing moment, Jake felt stronger. And the danger that was coming? It didn't stand a chance. The storm outside raged on, but inside Jake's garage, it was quiet. The only sound was the steady hum of the heater, the occasional creak of the building as it settled, and the soft clink of tools as Jake moved around. He had put Lily to bed in the spare room. The bed was small, and the blankets old, but it was safe. For the first time in a long while, she seemed to be sleeping peacefully. Jake couldn't help but glance toward the room, a wave of protectiveness washing over him. He'd been in the club long enough to know how quickly things could go south. But this wasn't just another run, another job. This was something different. Something that felt personal. Lily wasn't just any child. She carried a burden, one that was far heavier than any kid her age should ever have to bear. And now Jake had to figure out how to protect her from the people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Jake had always lived by the code. Protect your brothers, take care of your own, and never show weakness. But now, with Lily, the lines were becoming blurred. He wasn't just protecting her from a physical threat. He was protecting her from the dark world she had unknowingly stepped into. He didn't know exactly what the key she mentioned was, or why it was so important, but he knew enough to understand that it was dangerous. Whoever these people were, they wouldn't hesitate to go after anyone in their path. And Lily was in their path now. Jake had seen the way she flinched whenever she talked about the people chasing her. Whoever they weren't just after a physical object. They were after something far more dangerous. Jake knew he had to act fast. He couldn't sit around waiting for things to unfold. He had to take control of the situation, and that meant finding out exactly who these people were and why they wanted Lily. He needed answers. The problem was, the answers weren't easy to find. He had contacts in the club, of course, but this was a different kind of threat. It wasn't just a matter of throwing a punch or outlasting a rival gang. This was about something bigger, something hidden beneath layers of secrecy. And Jake wasn't sure if even the Hells Angels could help him figure it out. He ran a hand through his hair and took a deep breath. There was no time for doubt. He had to keep moving forward, for Lily's sake. He grabbed his phone from the counter and scrolled through the contacts, stopping on one name. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. Tony Steele Ferraro. Steele had always been the one Jake turned to when he needed information from the darker corners of the world. He wasn't part of the club, but he knew people. Dangerous people. People who knew things. Jake punched in the number and waited. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Jake, Steele said, his voice thick with an accent Jake recognized immediately. What's going on? Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need info. A little girl. She's in trouble. She's got something someone wants, and they're coming after her. I need to know who's behind it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could almost hear Steele's mind working. You sure about this, Jake? You're talking about people who don't just mess around. I know, Jake said, his voice steady. That's why I'm asking you. Who are they? What do they want? Steele sighed. You've got yourself in a mess, Jake. But I'll help you out. I'll dig around. But this isn't something you're going to get answers to quickly. It's going to take time. I don't have time, Jake replied, his voice sharp. This kid is in danger. I need to know now. Steele was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. All right. I'll see what I can find. But be careful, Jake. These people, they're not just after a key. They're after something bigger. Something more dangerous than you realize. Jake's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not going to let them hurt her, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her. Steele didn't reply immediately, but Jake could hear the hesitation in his voice when he finally spoke. You better be ready for what's coming, Jake. This is just the beginning. Jake hung up the phone and stared at the screen for a moment. The weight of Steele's words hung in the air, but Jake pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to think about what might happen, not when Lily was counting on him. He turned and walked toward the back room, where Lily was sleeping. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, and he glanced in at the small figure tucked under the covers. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. It broke his heart to think of the danger she was in, but he would keep her safe. He had to, because if he didn't, no one else would. Jake stepped back, closing the door quietly behind him, and walked back into the main part of the garage. His mind was racing again, but this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, and he wasn't going to stop until the threat was gone. Jake sat in the dimly lit garage, the flicker of a single overhead light casting long shadows against the walls. His mind raced, thinking over the conversation with Steele. Whoever was after Lily, whatever they wanted, it was bigger than he had expected. And now, he had a new challenge. Time was running out. He had to act fast, and he had to act smart. The danger wasn't just lurking outside, it was closing in on them. And as much as Jake wanted to protect Lily, he had to prepare for whatever might come next. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Steele. Asterisk, I've got some info. Meet me at the usual place. Bring the girl. Asterisk, Jake's eyes narrowed. The usual place wasn't far, but it was a risky move. He glanced over at the spare room where Lily was sleeping. He wasn't sure if it was the right time to involve her in this, but she needed to know what was happening. She had already been through enough. He stood up, rubbing his eyes. This wasn't how he had imagined things would go when he found her. But there was no turning back now. He needed answers, and Steele was his best shot. Jake grabbed his leather jacket and swung it over his shoulder. He moved toward the back room and opened the door quietly, not wanting to wake Lily just yet. She was curled up in the bed, her face peaceful for the moment. But Jake knew that peace wouldn't last long, not with what was coming for them. He walked in, crouching beside her. Her small, fragile form looked so innocent, so unaware of the danger that was about to descend on her. Jake felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't the life a little girl should lead, but it was the life she had been thrust into, and it was his responsibility to protect her. Lily, he whispered softly, his voice barely above a breath. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. Jake's heart ached. This girl had been through more in her short life than most people would experience in a lifetime. And now, she was trusting him to keep her safe. Lily, he said again, a little louder this time. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked, disoriented for a moment. When her gaze landed on Jake, she sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. What's wrong? She asked softly, her voice thick with sleep. We need to go, Jake said, his voice low and serious. I've got a lead. We're going to meet someone who can help us. But we have to be careful. Understand? Lily nodded, her expression serious now. She had seen enough to know that things weren't normal. She was no stranger to fear, but she trusted Jake. And that trust was something Jake wasn't about to betray. He helped her to her feet, grabbing her jacket and slipping it on her. She looked up at him with wide eyes. Are you sure we should go? She asked. I mean, what if they find us? Jake didn't have an answer to that. He couldn't promise her that they wouldn't find them. He couldn't promise her anything. But what he could promise was that he would do everything in his power to protect her. And that was enough for him. We'll be fine, Jake said, giving her a reassuring smile. Just stick with me, okay? They left the room quietly, making their way to the back door. Jake glanced outside before stepping into the cold night air. The storm had eased up a little, but the streets were still slick with rain, and the wind was biting. Jake's motorcycle sat just outside, its engine gleaming in the low light. He helped Lily onto the back, securing her in place before straddling the bike himself. As they made their way toward the meeting spot, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence in the streets was too thick, too ominous. He glanced over at Lily, who was pressed against his back, her small arms wrapped tightly around him. He felt the weight of her trust, and it only made him more determined to keep her safe. They reached the usual spot in record time, a rundown warehouse just on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of place where business was done quietly. Jake parked the bike and looked over at Lily. "Stay close," he said, his voice gruff. Lily nodded, her face serious. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew Jake was in charge, and she trusted him. As they entered the warehouse, the musty smell of old wood and rusted metal filled the air. Steele was waiting for them by the back door, his arms crossed and a look of impatience on his face. He didn't seem surprised to see them together. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "Jake," he said, nodding at him. "And the kid. You're lucky I didn't send someone to get you. What's going on?" Jake didn't waste time. "Tell me what you found. Who's after her?" Steele looked around, making sure no one was listening. "It's bigger than you think, Jake. This isn't just some random gang trying to get their hands on something. This is a whole network. People with power. Dangerous people. And they don't care who they hurt to get what they want." Jake's stomach tightened. He had a bad feeling about this. He had always known that the world he lived in was dangerous. But this was something else. Something he wasn't prepared for. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Steele met his gaze. "We move fast. We don't wait. If we wait, it's over for her. And for you." Jake stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the words Steele had spoken still echoing in his mind. Dangerous people. A whole network. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just about a missing key or some petty rivalry. This was something much bigger. His gut told him they were up against forces that even the Hell's Angels might not be able to handle. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of it all. Lily, standing beside him, was unaware of just how deep the hole they were in had already become. She looked at Jake with those wide, innocent eyes, her trust in him unwavering. But Jake knew he couldn't protect her forever. The stakes had escalated, and the game was changing. Steele wasn't saying it outright, but Jake could sense the urgency in his voice. They didn't have time to waste. The longer they waited, the more dangerous this situation would become. They had to act now. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked, his voice steady but carrying the weight of responsibility. Steele took a moment before answering, his face hardening. "You need to get Lily out of here, Jake. I don't care where you take her, but you need to get her away from this. You don't know what you're up against. These people don't care about anything or anyone. If they're after her, they'll stop at nothing." Jake's stomach tightened. "You're not telling me everything, Steele," he said, his tone sharp. Steele shifted uncomfortably. "I don't have time to explain it all, Jake. But trust me when I say you don't want to be in the middle of this. It's bigger than anything you've dealt with before." Jake nodded, though the unease in his chest was growing. "Where do we go?" Steele looked around before lowering his voice. "There's an old safe house out by the lake. It's isolated, off the grid. It'll be hard to find. Stay there until we can figure out what to do next. You need to lay low for a while." Jake was silent for a moment, his mind racing through options. There was no way he was just going to run and hide, but Steele's warning echoed in his mind. The situation was escalating too quickly, and he had no choice but to trust Steele's judgment. He had to protect Lily. That was the only thing that mattered. "All right," Jake said finally, his voice firm. "We'll go to the lake." Steele nodded, his face unreadable. "Good. Get moving. I'll handle things here." Jake turned to Lily, who was still standing quietly by his side. He couldn't look at her without feeling a sense of responsibility wash over him. This little girl had already been through too much, and now she was depending on him to keep her safe. He wasn't about to fail her. "Come on, kid," Jake said, his voice softer now. "We're going to get you somewhere safe." Lily nodded and followed him without a word, but Jake could see the unease in her eyes. She didn't ask questions, didn't push for answers. She just trusted him, and that trust was something Jake wasn't about to break. They made their way to the back of the warehouse, where Jake's motorcycle was parked. The rain had stopped, but the night was still cold and damp, the streets eerily quiet. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had no idea what they were really up against, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. He revved the engine of his bike and helped Lily onto the back. She clung to him, her small body pressed against his back as they took off into the night. The wind whipped through Jake's hair, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the need to get Lily to safety. He didn't know how far they had to go, or how long they could keep running, but he would keep her safe as long as he had breath in his lungs. They drove for what felt like hours, the roads growing more isolated as they left the city behind. The farther they went, the more Jake's tension grew. He kept glancing over his shoulder, making sure no one was following them. But the night remained quiet, the only sound the roar of the motorcycle and the rhythm of the tires on the wet asphalt. Eventually, they reached the safe house, a small cabin tucked away in the woods by the lake. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned at first glance, but Jake knew better. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the door had been reinforced to keep unwanted visitors out. Jake parked the bike and helped Lily off, leading her inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but it was clean and comfortable. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and there was a simple bed tucked into the corner. "You'll be safe here," Jake said as he closed the door behind them. "We'll figure this out, Lily. I won't let them hurt you." Lily nodded, but Jake could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. She had already been through so much, and now she was here, trapped in a dangerous game that she had never asked for. Jake walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness. The silence was deafening, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something worse than anything he had faced before. But he couldn't let that fear show. Not in front of Lily. She needed him to be strong. He turned back to her, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." Lily nodded and made her way to the bed, curling up under the blankets. Jake sat down in a chair by the window, keeping a watchful eye on the night. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. He would fight to protect Lily, no matter what. The danger was just beginning, and Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake sat by the window, his eyes scanning the dark expanse of the woods that surrounded the cabin. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed felt heavier, more suffocating. He wasn't used to being still, used to moving, to the constant rush of the road and the hum of the engine beneath him. But tonight, everything was different. Lily was safe, for now, but Jake knew that could change in an instant. His thoughts kept circling back to her, to the burden she carried, the danger she had unleashed, and the people who were still out there looking for her. He couldn't help but wonder how long they would be able to hide, how long they could stay ahead of the storm that was coming for them. Every time he closed his eyes, the faces of the people chasing Lily flashed in his mind, and he could feel the weight of their pursuit pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a little girl anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that Jake wasn't sure he was prepared for. But he couldn't let Lily see his doubts. She needed him to be strong, to be the protector she believed him to be. Jake had learned long ago that in times like this, you had to bury your fears, bury your own pain, and focus on the task at hand. There would be time for reckoning later. For now, he needed to make sure Lily was safe. He looked over at the bed where she lay, her small figure barely visible beneath the blankets. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted by everything that had happened. Jake felt a pang in his chest as he watched her. She deserved to have a normal childhood, free from fear and danger. Instead, she was caught in a world she didn't understand, and it was his job to protect her from it. He stood up slowly, the creak of the floorboards echoing in the quiet room. He needed to check the perimeter one more time, just to be sure. He wasn't taking any chances. He grabbed his jacket and slipped it on, moving quietly through the cabin. The night air was cold as he stepped outside, the ground beneath his boots soft with the remnants of the rain. The woods were dark and still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp air. It was peaceful here, far from the noise and chaos of the world he'd left behind. But even in this calm, Jake knew that danger could be lurking just beyond the trees. He walked around the cabin, checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. It was a habit, one that had been drilled into him over the years. You never knew when someone would come for you, when danger would find its way to your door. The minutes stretched into hours, but Jake remained alert. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. Eventually, he made his way back inside, his eyes immediately finding Lily, still sleeping soundly. He let out a quiet breath and moved to the window, looking out into the dark night once more. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world in shadow. It felt like the calm before the storm, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than he could prepare for. As he stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sudden noise broke the silence, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He pulled the phone out and saw the message from Steele. They're closing in. We don't have much time. Jake's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. The people who were after Lily were getting closer. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He quickly typed a reply. I'll be ready. There was no time to waste. He had to act now. He turned back to Lily, his mind racing. He couldn't keep her here forever. The safe house was only temporary, and soon enough, they would be forced to move again. But where? He didn't have all the answers, but he had to keep moving, keep protecting her. That was all he could do. As he gathered his gear, preparing for whatever came next, Jake looked at Lily one last time. She was still asleep, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. He wished he could shield her from all of it, but that wasn't possible. The world was a dangerous place, and Jake had learned that the hard way. But as long as he had breath in his lungs, as long as he could still fight, he would keep her safe. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not while he was still standing. Jake knew the storm was far from over. As he secured his gear and prepared to leave the safe house, he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in on them. Steele's message had made it clear they didn't have much time. He checked the window one last time, scanning the shadows outside. The woods around the cabin were quiet, but Jake had learned never to trust silence. He grabbed his jacket and turned toward Lily's room. She was still asleep, her small body curled up under the covers, unaware of the urgency in the air. Jake hated that she had to live like this, always running, always hiding. She deserved so much more. But there was no time for that now. He had to keep her safe. He walked over to her, kneeling beside the bed. For a moment, he just watched her, her face calm in sleep, the innocence of a child that had been lost in the chaos of the world. He touched her shoulder gently, his heart heavy. Lily, he whispered softly. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Jake? She asked, her voice groggy but clear. It's time to go, he said quietly. We're leaving. Lily blinked a few times, trying to process the words, but she didn't question him. She trusted him, and that trust was something Jake wasn't about to betray. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Where are we going? She asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers. He couldn't explain it to her, but he had to keep moving. We're going to meet someone. They can help us. Lily nodded, her face serious now. She had seen enough to know that things weren't normal, and she had learned to accept that there were things Jake couldn't explain. Without another word, she climbed out of bed and slipped on her jacket. Jake moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the room one last time. He wasn't sure if this would be the last time they were here, but he had to be ready for anything. They couldn't stay here forever. The people after Lily weren't going to give up, and Jake wasn't going to let them take her. As they stepped outside, the crisp air hit them, and Jake felt the weight of the situation settle back into his chest. He had no idea what was waiting for them, but he knew they couldn't stay here any longer. He helped Lily onto the bike, starting the engine and revving it to life. The rumble of the motorcycle cut through the stillness of the night, and Jake felt a sense of determination settle in. They were leaving. They were going to keep moving, no matter what. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had been on the road long enough to know that fear wouldn't help him now. He had to stay focused, stay strong for Lily. They rode in silence, the cold wind whipping through Jake's hair as he glanced over his shoulder every few minutes, making sure they weren't being followed. The city was a distant memory now, the lights of the buildings fading behind them as they ventured further into the unknown. The only sound was the wind and the rumble of the bike beneath them. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had been in this game long enough to know when someone was tailing you. And as much as he tried to push the thought away, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. They were not alone. As they rode through the winding roads, the familiar sense of danger crept up on him again. He wasn't sure what Steele had found out, But Jake didn't need more information. He knew enough to understand that whatever was coming next was going to be big. They finally reached their destination, a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where no questions were asked, where people came and went without notice. It wasn't much, but it was safe, for now. Jake parked the bike and helped Lily off, making sure she was steady on her feet. "Stay close," he told her, his voice low. She nodded, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. Jake couldn't blame her. He wasn't thrilled to be here either, but it was the best option for now. They walked toward the door, Jake keeping his head low, watching the road behind them. When they entered the motel, the scent of stale air and cigarette smoke hit them. It wasn't the most welcoming place, but it would do. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as Jake paid for a room. He didn't ask for a name, didn't ask questions. That was the way things worked here. As they made their way to the room, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. His instincts told him they weren't alone. He checked the rearview mirror every few minutes, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Lily was silent, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't have to say anything. He knew she was scared. They both were. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He would keep her safe, no matter what it took. They reached the room, and Jake quickly locked the door behind them. The moment the door clicked shut, Lily sighed in relief. Jake turned to her, offering a tired smile. "We're safe for now," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was far from true. They weren't safe. Not yet. But they would be. He would make sure of it. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window that overlooked the motel parking lot. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the glass. But it was the stillness that unsettled him the most. It felt like the calm before a storm, but not the kind you could prepare for. The kind that crept up on you when you least expected it. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just about the people who were after Lily anymore. It was about the uncertainty of it all. He didn't know who to trust, where to go, or how to keep her safe. All he knew was that he couldn't stop running, and he couldn't let her out of his sight. Jake ran a hand through his hair and stood up, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here forever. He knew that. But where could they go next? The thought of leaving Lily alone, even for a moment, made his stomach tighten. She was scared. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way she looked at him when he walked into the room. She trusted him, and that trust was the only thing keeping them both going. He had to be strong for her. He had to keep moving. After a few minutes, Jake walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room and grabbed his phone. There was no new message from Steele, no sign that anyone else had found them. The silence was deafening, but it didn't reassure Jake. He needed answers. He needed to know who was behind this, what they wanted, and how to stop them. But for now, all he could do was wait. As he set the phone down, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Lily standing in the doorway, her small frame framed by the dim light from the hallway. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we really safe here?" Jake's heart clenched. He didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know what safe even meant anymore. "I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe, Lily," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty inside him. "But I don't know how long we can stay here. We'll have to move soon." She nodded, but there was a faraway look in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him, too. She had seen too much for someone so young. She had been through more than most people could imagine. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. Jake walked over to her and knelt down, putting a hand on her shoulder. "There's nothing to apologize for," he said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're just trying to survive, like everyone else." Lily sniffled and wiped her eyes, but she didn't say anything else. Jake stood up and stepped back toward the window. He had to be strong for her, but the weight of the situation was starting to wear him down. The constant worry, the fear of being caught, of being unable to protect her, it was all starting to feel like too much. He looked back at Lily, still standing in the doorway, and felt a surge of protectiveness rise in his chest. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He wouldn't. "I won't let them hurt you," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him she believed him. For now, that was enough. He turned back to the window, watching the rain fall, and tried to clear his mind. He needed a plan, but it wasn't coming. All he had were instincts, and right now, They told him that he couldn't stay here. Not if they wanted any chance of getting away from whoever was after them. After a moment, Jake turned back to Lily. "Pack your things. We're leaving." She nodded silently, and Jake could see the determination in her face. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. She was stronger than he had given her credit for. As she gathered her things, Jake checked the room one more time. There was no sign of anyone watching, no hint that they were being followed. But he knew that could change in an instant. The danger was still out there. He was just hoping they had enough time to get ahead of it. After a few minutes, Lily was ready, and they were out the door. Jake led her to the bike, making sure she was secure before getting on himself. The road ahead was dark, the rain still falling in sheets, but they had to move. They couldn't stay here any longer. As Jake started the bike and pulled out of the parking lot, he felt the familiar rush of the road beneath him. The sound of the engine, the wind whipping around them. It was a small comfort in the chaos. But it didn't last long. As they reached the edge of town, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled over and checked it. It was a message from Steele. Asterisk, "They know where you are. You need to move now." Asterisk, Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask who they were. He already knew. The storm was coming. And this time, it was too close for comfort. Jake's hands tightened on the handlebars as the engine of the motorcycle roared to life. The rain had picked up, pouring down in sheets that made the road ahead almost impossible to see. But Jake didn't slow down. They couldn't afford to stop now. He had just read Steele's message. Asterisk, "They know where you are. You need to move now." Asterisk, the word stuck in his mind as he sped through the winding streets. Lily's small figure pressed against his back. He could feel the weight of the situation settling heavily in his chest. Whoever was after them was getting closer. Every instinct Jake had screamed that danger was only a few steps behind. The quiet was eerie, the kind of silence that always preceded the worst of storms. As they neared the edge of town, Jake's grip on the throttle tightened. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a plan. But what he did know was that he had to keep moving. For Lily, she was depending on him, and no matter how uncertain the road ahead was, Jake wasn't going to stop. They passed familiar streets, but it all felt wrong. Every corner he turned felt like it could be their last. He checked the rearview mirror again, but the road behind them was empty. For now, anyway. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled over to the side of the road and answered without looking at the number. "Jake," the voice on the other end said, low and urgent. It was Steele. "They've got eyes on you. You need to ditch the bike and go off-road. The safe house is compromised. Get off the road now." Jake's pulse quickened. He didn't have to ask what that meant. Whoever was after them had found their trail. "Where do we go?" Jake asked, his voice steady, even though every fiber of his being screamed for action. Steele's voice lowered, and Jake could almost feel the gravity of the situation. "I'm sending you a location. Go there, and don't look back." The line went dead, and Jake immediately pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he checked the new message. The location was several miles away, deep in the woods. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and turned to Lily. "We've got to move, kid," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Lily, sensing the change in the air, nodded, her face pale but resolute. She trusted him, and Jake couldn't afford to break that trust. He needed to get them both to safety, no matter the cost. He revved the engine and shot forward, weaving through the streets at a pace that made his heart race. They needed to get to the woods. Now, as they reached the outskirts of town, Jake's mind raced. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would catch up to them. But for now, all he could do was keep moving, keep pushing forward, and pray they made it to the new location before it was too late. The trees began to grow thicker on either side of the road, the familiar cityscape now a distant memory. The further they went, the less Jake could see through the windshield, the rain blurring his vision. But he didn't slow down. The forest loomed ahead like a dark tunnel, and Jake aimed the bike straight for it. The engine roared as they hit the dirt path, the rough terrain bouncing them around as they sped deeper into the woods. Every bump, every turn, made Jake's heart race faster. He couldn't afford to get thrown off now. Lily's arms tightened around him as they sped through the trees, but she didn't say a word. Jake glanced over his shoulder again, half expecting to see headlights behind them, but the road remained empty. Still, He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The farther they went, the more isolated they became, the only sounds the thrum of the engine and the rush of the wind. They needed to get to the cabin, but it felt like they were being pulled into the heart of the storm. When the woods seemed to close in around them, Jake saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, tucked into the trees like it had been abandoned for years, the perfect place to hide. But the closer they got, the more Jake felt the weight of what was coming. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. He pulled up to the cabin, dismounting quickly. "Stay close," he told Lily, his voice low and firm. She nodded, her eyes wide, but she didn't argue. They weren't alone anymore. He could feel it in the air. As they approached the door, Jake's instincts flared, his body tense, ready for anything. But when they opened the door, the place was empty. The room inside was dark, lit only by the flickering light of a dying fire in the hearth. Jake moved cautiously through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. He didn't trust it, not for a second. But there was no sign of anyone else. Yet, Jake motioned for Lily to stay near the door. "I'll keep watch," he said, though the words felt hollow. They were far from safe. He could hear his own heartbeat, the pounding in his ears, but he knew better than to show fear. Not now. Not when she was depending on him. As he sat down in a chair by the door, his eyes constantly scanning the room, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let anyone take Lily. Not now. Not ever. Jake sat still in the dimly lit cabin, his senses alert to every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside. The air was thick with tension, and though the room was quiet, Jake knew better than to trust the silence. Lily sat across from him, her small figure huddled near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived, but Jake could feel the unease in her. The same unease that had settled in his gut. The safe house Steele had directed them to was more of a temporary hideout than a place of refuge. It was isolated, yes, but the more Jake sat in the stillness, the more he felt the weight of the danger bearing down on them. He could feel it creeping in from all sides, that creeping sensation that they weren't alone, even if the cabin appeared deserted. The world outside was a storm of unknowns. He needed to stay alert. He had to protect Lily. He glanced over at her, her head down, staring into the fire. She was trying to be brave, trying to hold it together. But Jake could see the fear in her eyes. He had seen it in too many people before. Fear was a silent thing. It didn't scream. It just waited. He couldn't let her be afraid. He had to be strong for her. He had to keep his mind sharp, even when his body wanted to shut down. He leaned forward and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. "Stay here, Lily," he said gently, but firmly. She didn't look up at first, her fingers tracing the edges of the blanket. But when she finally met his eyes, there was a silent understanding between them. She trusted him, and for that, Jake would do anything. "I'll be right back. Just need to check the perimeter." Lily nodded quietly, her eyes a mix of fear and resolve. Jake stepped outside into the cold night air, pulling his collar up to shield his neck from the wind. He took a deep breath, his senses sharpening as he scanned the surrounding woods. The forest was dense, and the moon was barely visible behind the heavy clouds, leaving the land in near total darkness. But Jake had been in worse situations. He had survived worse. His eyes shifted from the shadows of the trees to the cabin, and he felt something stir in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was the quiet or the stillness, but something didn't sit right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There was movement in the distance, just a flicker of something out of the corner of his eye, but it was enough to make Jake's heart race. He held still, watching, waiting. His instincts told him not to move, to keep hidden, to stay out of sight. He didn't know who it was, but he wasn't taking any chances. He waited in the darkness, his breath steady and slow. It felt like hours before the movement stopped, and Jake finally allowed himself to exhale. He stayed there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep within him. No, it wasn't time to relax. Not yet. He turned around and made his way back to the cabin, his mind racing. What was that? Was someone out there? He couldn't let his guard down. Not with Lily inside. He opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning the room as he stepped in. Lily was still sitting by the fire, her eyes watching him intently. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just keeping an eye on things." He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his eyes still focused on the shadows outside. We need to keep moving. We can't stay here much longer. Lily stood up, her small frame wrapped in the blanket. She looked at Jake, her face full of questions. What do you mean? I thought this was safe. Jake's heart ached at the look in her eyes. She was just a kid, and all she wanted was to feel safe. But Jake knew better. This wasn't about safety anymore. This was about survival. It's not safe enough. Not with what's coming. He moved toward her, his hands resting on her shoulders. We're going to find a way out of this, Lily. I promise. She nodded, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. I'm scared, Jake, she whispered. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't know how to make her feel better, how to reassure her that everything would be all right. Because he wasn't sure it would be. But he had to try. I know you're scared, he said softly, his voice low. But we're in this together, okay? We'll get through it. Just stick with me. Lily's eyes searched his face, looking for the reassurance he couldn't give her. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Jake held her gaze for a long moment, then looked away, his mind still spinning with questions. They couldn't stay here, but where could they go? He didn't have the answers, but he would keep fighting until he found them. They had to move. And they had to move now. Get your things, Lily, Jake said, his voice hardening with determination. We leave in 5 minutes. Lily nodded and quickly grabbed the few belongings she had left. Jake's heart tightened as he watched her, knowing this was no life for a child. But as long as they had each other, they had a chance. He would make sure of that. As the wind howled outside, Jake took one last look at the cabin, his mind racing with what to do next. This was just the beginning. He could feel it in his bones. And whatever was coming, he wasn't going to face it alone. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on them. Even as he packed the few belongings they had left, his thoughts raced, trying to anticipate the next move. The air outside was colder now, the wind biting through his jacket as they prepared to leave the cabin. He had no clear plan, just the instinct to keep moving, to stay ahead of whoever was chasing them. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he refused to let it show. Lily was already bundled up, standing near the door, her small figure a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. She had been so quiet lately, but Jake knew better than to ask her how she felt. She was afraid, and he didn't blame her. The world they were in now was far different from the one she should have been living in. She should have been in school, playing with friends, not hiding from people who wanted to harm her. Jake walked over to her, putting a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer the comfort he couldn't find for himself. Ready to go? He asked gently. Lily nodded, though her eyes betrayed the fear she was holding back. Jake gave her a small smile, but it didn't feel real. He could see it in her face, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what might be coming. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay, but he could promise that he wouldn't stop fighting. He wouldn't stop protecting her. They stepped outside, the cold air hitting them like a slap in the face. The world felt vast and empty, and for a moment, Jake wondered if they were the only two people left. He revved the motorcycle, the engine roaring to life, and Lily climbed onto the back, wrapping her arms around him tightly. As they sped down the dirt road, the wind in his face, Jake couldn't help but think about the road ahead. Where could they go? Steele had given him a location, but Jake knew that it was just another temporary stop, another place to hide until the people after them found it. He couldn't keep running forever. The thought of leaving Lily in hiding, of never being able to provide her with a safe place to live, made Jake's stomach turn. But for now, this was all he could do. He had to keep moving. They rode for hours, the roads becoming more isolated the further they went. The world outside was a blur, the trees flashing by as Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if Steele's lead was a trap? What if there was no escape? Every time Jake looked back, he half expected to see headlights in the distance, but the road behind them was always empty. The silence was deafening, but Jake knew better than to trust it. He kept pushing forward, keeping Lily close, watching for any sign that they weren't alone. The landscape around them shifted, and Jake recognized the area as they approached the location Steele had sent. The cabin wasn't much, just another small, weathered building hidden among the trees, but it would have to do for now. They pulled up to the front, and Jake glanced around, scanning the area for any signs of movement. It was quiet, too quiet, and Jake's instincts flared. He helped Lily off the bike, scanning the trees around them before they approached the cabin. The door creaked open slowly as Jake pushed it with one hand, his other hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. The cabin was dark, its interior cold and empty. There was a small fire pit in the center, but it had long since burned out. The place had the feel of a temporary hideaway, abandoned by whoever had used it before. Jake stepped inside, his boots crunching on the dirt floor as he checked the back rooms. He wasn't sure who had left this place, or how long it had been sitting here, but it didn't matter. They would have to make it work. Lily stood near the door, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake walked over to the small window, peering out into the darkness. "We wait," he said, though the words didn't feel right. He hated the idea of just sitting there, waiting for whatever came next. But they had no other choice. As much as Jake hated to admit it, they were running out of options. He couldn't keep running forever. He turned back to Lily, offering her the most reassuring smile he could muster. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You're safe here, for now." But even as he said the words, he knew it wasn't true. They weren't safe, not really. The danger was still out there, and it was closing in on them. Jake didn't know how long they could keep running, but he wasn't going to stop until he found a way to put an end to it. They couldn't stay here forever, but for tonight, it would have to do. As Lily settled onto the makeshift bed in the corner, Jake stayed by the window, his mind working through every possibility. The weight of everything was bearing down on him, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. Lily needed him. He had to stay strong. He had to keep her safe. The night felt longer than usual, the darkness outside pressing in on the small cabin. Jake sat by the window, his eyes scanning the trees, the silence stretching on. His thoughts were as sharp as ever, but the restlessness gnawed at him, making every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees seem more menacing. Lily was asleep, wrapped in the blanket he had given her earlier, her small form barely visible in the dim light of the cabin. He had made sure she was as comfortable as possible, but he knew that the peace of sleep wouldn't last. Not with the people chasing her. Not with the danger looming. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but he couldn't let it show. He had to stay calm, stay alert, because Lily was counting on him. He couldn't afford to slip. He couldn't afford to fail her. He looked down at his hands, the calluses worn deep from years of working, of fighting, of surviving. But none of that had prepared him for the responsibility he felt now. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about keeping her safe, no matter the cost. He stood up and stretched, his muscles aching from the long hours of tension. His mind raced as he tried to think of their next move. They couldn't stay here much longer. He had no idea where they would go next, but they had to keep moving, keep running. The question was, how long could they stay ahead of those hunting them? How long could they survive in a world where their every step was being tracked? He ran his hand through his hair and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The storm had died down, but the night was still thick with uncertainty. The trees swayed in the breeze, their shadows long and twisting. He took a deep breath, the chill of the air filling his lungs, and began to pace. His mind was a whirlwind of plans, none of which felt like they would work. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't have the resources or the backup he needed. But what he did have was the will to fight, and that had to be enough. As he walked around the cabin, his eyes flicked toward the distant road. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't let him sit still. He had to keep moving, even if it was just to reassure himself that they were safe. That's when he heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was the unmistakable hum of an engine, the sound of a vehicle approaching. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. His instincts kicked in, every nerve in his body alert. He quickly moved back to the cabin and peered through the window, straining to see through the darkness. The sound of the engine was growing closer, and with it, Jake's sense of urgency. Whoever it was, they weren't here for a friendly visit. He turned back to Lily, still asleep in the corner. He needed to wake her, to get her ready to move. He grabbed his phone and quickly typed a message to Steele. Asterisk, they're here. We need to move. Now. Asterisk, the message sent, and Jake's fingers tightened around the phone. He had no idea what would happen next, but he couldn't wait around to find out. The engine was getting closer. He quickly grabbed his gear, making sure everything was packed and ready to go. The door to the cabin was still locked, but Jake didn't trust it. He had to get Lily out, and fast. He turned back to her, his face serious. "Lily," he said gently, shaking her awake. She stirred, her eyes slowly opening, confusion crossing her face as she looked at him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "We need to go," Jake said urgently. "Now? Get your things. It's time to move." Her eyes widened as she sat up, her body tensing. "What's happening?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "We're not safe here anymore," Jake replied. "We have to move. Do you understand?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide, but there was no hesitation in her actions. She quickly grabbed her things, and Jake motioned for her to follow him. They moved swiftly through the cabin, making sure to check every window, every corner. There was no time to waste. The engine. Noise outside was unmistakable now. Whoever it was, they were close. Jake moved toward the door, but before he could open it, he heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires. They were here. They had found them. The cold air from outside hit Jake as he opened the door, but he didn't stop to take a breath. He helped Lily out first, keeping his hand firmly on her shoulder. He knew they had to move quickly, but every step felt heavier, more dangerous. The moment they stepped outside, Jake scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. The vehicle was just beyond the trees, and Jake could see the outline of a figure moving in the distance. The silence of the woods felt oppressive, every sound amplified in the stillness. "Stay close," Jake whispered to Lily. "We need to get to the bike." They moved as quickly as they could, Jake's eyes constantly scanning the area for any sign of movement. The bike was parked nearby, and Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The engine was still running, the hum of it filling the night air. Jake glanced back at Lily, making sure she was right behind him. He had no idea who was out there or what they wanted, but one thing was certain. They weren't going to let them go without a fight. They reached the bike, and Jake quickly helped Lily onto the back. He revved the engine, his heart racing. This wasn't just another escape. This was real. They were being hunted, and there was no way to outrun the storm that was closing in on them. The bike roared to life, and Jake tore down the dirt road, the sound of the engine echoing in the night. They had to get away. They had to survive. And Jake wasn't about to stop fighting until they did.